Buongiorno a tutti. Iniziamo questa sessione, l'ultima sessione di questo convegno. Mi dispiace, purtroppo non ho potuto partecipare ieri perché ho dovuto partire nel pomeriggio, al contrario di quanto avevo preventivato. So comunque che è stato un convegno di grande interesse e lo sarà così, sono sicuro, anche per questa mattina. Vi do intanto due indicazioni che forse già sapete. C'è un cambiamento nel programma. Mario Fales, la comunicazione è stata ieri, stamattina ci sarà la comunicazione di Rosa Barovier Mentasti. Gli interventi sono circa di 40 minuti, vediamo se eventualmente ci sarà spazio per una domanda dopo gli interventi, ma tendenzialmente poi lasciamo la discussione in fondo alla sessione al termine della mattinata. Vado a presentare il primo relatore. I'm going to shift in English in order just to introduce our first lecturer. Professor Jonathan Parry is Professor of Modern British History at the Pembroke College at Cambridge University. He's an expert. His field of interest is the British politics and political ideas. He published extensively on British liberalism and the concept of British liberalism. In particular, I remember the Politics of Patriotism, English Liberalism, National Identity and Europe, published in 2006, and the biography of Benjamin Disraeli in 2007. His paper is about Henry Layard's attempt to storm mid-Victorian British politics, successes and failure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes, I hope so. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here and to carry on the conference from yesterday, and to thank Stefania and Cecilia very much for their wonderful organising efforts. I thought we had a great day yesterday. So today I want to talk about Henry Layard as a politician in Britain. He was a member of Parliament in the British House of Commons from 1852 to 1857, and again from 1860 to 1869. When he started as an MP, he was already famous because of his discovery of Nineveh. In 1855, he nearly toppled the British government because of his attack on the conduct of the Crimean War, and at that time he was a radical hero. But he ended his political career in apparent failure. So in this paper I want to explain why he appeared a failure, but also to suggest that the reasons for that were closely connected with his priorities during the rest of his life outside politics. Layard was never a conventional politician, and he shouldn't be compared with radicals with the main school of radicals in the British Parliament. He was never a conventional radical. Nearly all his time in Parliament was spent dealing with issues that had previously concerned him outside Parliament, principally issues to do with the East, with the Ottoman Empire, Persia, India, but also occasionally other themes that fascinated him, such as art, which I won't talk about, but we might come to later on today. So my point really is that expertise was the big theme of his political career, that he spoke on things that he considered himself to be expert on. He believed MPs should be expert. He believed in knowledge, in useful knowledge, and in communicating knowledge and being taken seriously because of his knowledge. He was actually a bit of a Benthamite. I don't know how many of you know about Jeremy Bentham. Here he is. He's embalmed in his case at University College London, where he's been ever since he died in 1832. Bentham was a radical utilitarian philosopher, very much the exponent of useful knowledge. And Layard, as a young man, when he was living with his uncle and aunt, they were living in Bloomsbury. They were connected, I think, with the circles, not only around the British Museum, but also around University College. And I was thinking yesterday, when we saw those wonderful drawings of the chambers at Nineveh, all meticulously labelled and catalogued. I think that there's an element in Layard of an exact statistician type who's very concerned with precise knowledge and believes in it. So he went into politics proclaiming himself an expert on the East. He made it his business to talk about the East and about other diplomatic issues, and he never claimed to be an expert in anything else and hardly ever spoke about anything else. And when he left politics in 1869, it was to be a diplomat, which was in fact the career that he had wanted as a young man. So the whole of his political career can be seen as him being drawn away from diplomacy, which perhaps was his main interest. So as you will know, Layard spent nearly 10 years in the Ottoman Empire and Persia as a young man between 1839 and 1848. And I would suggest that from at least 1840, he had realized that his main interest in the East was to become a diplomat, to become an expert on Eastern affairs. I think his time with the Bakhtiari in Persia turned into an attempt to develop trade links with the Bakhtiari, which would benefit the British and the Bakhtiari. I think that that's the moment at which he realized that there was a political mission out there in the East that he could deliver on. But he was also unsuccessful in his attempts to become a paid diplomat. And his whole instincts were affected by that failure to develop a successful diplomatic career in the 1840s. And he wasn't alone in this, because his three brothers also suffered at this time from the difficulties of getting promotion in their respective fields. Two of them were in the army. The older two brothers were in the army, and the youngest, Edgar, attempted to be a diplomat unsuccessfully. And so the four Layard children represented, in his own eyes, the failure of the British state to reward talented men of ability but no wealth and no connections. Because the Layards had been brought up to believe in public service. The grandfather was in the Church of England. Their father was in the Ceylon civil service until he was invalided out with ill health. So all the Layard sons believed in a career of public service, but they lacked the connections actually to achieve one. And so the two who joined the army struggled to win promotion. And Layard's later campaign for the abolition of the purchase of commissions in the army was an attempt to open up the army to men of merit and talent. Certainly from the time he arrived in Constantinople in 1842, Layard hoped for a diplomatic career. I would argue that even his posting to Nineveh was an attempt to promote his diplomatic prospects. He didn't get a paid attacheship until 1849, and it was ironic that that was the same year that Nineveh and its Remains was published, because that, I think, drew him away from the diplomatic career that he had actually wanted for the last 8 or 9 years. And it tempted him to believe that he could have a career in domestic politics instead, because of the fame that it brought him. Now, Nineveh and its Remains is a great book at many levels, but the main image of him that it left on readers at the time was as a man of talent, a self-made man whose initiative, whose courage, whose perseverance, and whose management of the local tribes had allowed him single-handedly to defeat the obstacles to success thrown up by the hostile environment, by the hostility of the officials, and so on. And so if you look at the very first page of Nineveh and its Remains, he talks about, he and Mitford going out as ordinary men, not concerned with luxury, not concerned to fit into convention, and mixing among the people of the East without prejudice. And later on, he stressed that he was self-made, that he had no patron, no money, thrown entirely on his own decision and ingenuity. I went out not to ally with the great and affluent of other nations, but to sojourn among the people, that I might be improved by their counsel. And this sympathy for local people in the East was, of course, a very striking difference from many other travel writers at the time. So the reviews of Nineveh and its remains talked about Layard's self-confidence and his ability to manage the tribes. Of course, they were rather critical of the tribesmen. They weren't as generous as Layard himself, gesticulating and screaming Arabs and Chaldeans. He turned them into patient and persevering workmen. This was somebody who could rule the world because of his ability to rule the tribes of the East. The mayor of Leeds, he dealt with a Mahometan despot. He cooperated with idle and unruly Arabs and Asiatics debased by Turkish habits and customs. And so this all emphasized his courage, his perseverance, his judgment. The Liverpool Albion in 1855, he's a man of the people. He has lodgings in London. In the East, he's lived on a handful of dates or a broiled rat or a piece of pickled alligator on feast days. He is the Bedouin of Parliament. Now, the myth of Layard as a man of the people was crucial in his political success. And he wanted to be an MP when he came back from Baghdad in 1851, but he was actually given office in the government before he became an MP, which is very unusual, possible in fact. But in the Foreign Office, basically at the time, some ministerial posts were essentially sort of civil service posts, and they didn't require you to be an MP. And this was the case with the Under-Secretaryship of Foreign Affairs, to which Layard was appointed at the end of 1851. And the context of this is a great row between Lord Palmerston and the court, Prince Albert particularly, because Palmerston was removed as Foreign Secretary in December 1851. We don't need to go into the details, but Palmerston was then already a popular hero, a radical hero for his liberal foreign policy, and most newspapers assumed that he'd been removed by the influence of the court because they disliked his liberal foreign policy and his popularity. And so Layard was a very suitable replacement in the Foreign Office. The man who replaced Palmerston as Foreign Secretary was Lord Granville, but he was a member of the House of Lords. He was called My Lady's Lapdog by radicals. And so Layard, as the representative of the Foreign Office in the House of Commons to replace Palmerston, who had been in the Commons, was very appropriate because he seemed to be a man of the people. The Daily News said his appointment is a blow to exclusion and caste pretensions. It's a search for real merit. It converts shams into realities. It indicates a desire to employ the true workers of life. He's a man of the people. New phases are opening on humanity. It is intelligence, activity, zeal, and sound judgment that we require for doing the work of the nation. And Layard himself, who, of course, was not lacking in self-confidence, said much the same. I felt that a principle was involved in me, that for a first time the government, unmindful of family ties and political influence, had gone out of their way to offer place to one who had only received public approbation and had only merit to recommend him. Now, unfortunately, the government that Layard joined, the government of Lord John Russell, fell very quickly and was succeeded by a Conservative government led by Lord Derby, who did in fact ask Layard to stay in office because he realised he was quite a popular figure and also that he didn't really have a party attachment. But Layard declined in the end to remain in office and then became an MP for Aylesbury in July 1852. But, of course, we have to remember that Layard had been out of Britain nearly all his adult life, and he knew almost nothing about British politics. And in his adoption speech as an MP, he showed a distinct lack of grip on policy questions, particularly the issue of whether there should be further reform of Parliament, further extension of the franchise, which was the defining idea among radical MPs. He was asked at his first speech whether he would support Hume's motion for parliamentary reform, but he had to ask what it consisted of. And then he said he'd vote for whatever reform motion his fellow MP supported. And once elected, at his acceptance speech, he asked the audience if they'd like him to support the secret ballot, and they did, so he did. But this vagueness about reform continued in 1863. In a speech, he said, "I would give the vote to the man who has the intelligence to use it, but not to him who doesn't have the intelligence," which was not a very helpful phrase when it comes to drafting complicated legislation on the franchise. So Layard always liked to present himself as a man unfettered by any sort of commitments to either policy or to party. In 1852, he said he was determined to avoid any pledges which may hereafter fetter me. This was in fact not a completely unusual sort of approach. There were people who called themselves radicals who really claimed to represent the people in a very general and rather patriotic way, rather than to represent any sort of creed or party. But it is important to realise that Layard was in that tradition and was never a member of the main radical group in Parliament, which was led by John Bright and Richard Cobden, the so-called Manchester School, who favoured peace, low taxes and parliamentary reform. It's sometimes misunderstood that Layard had nothing to do with them because they came together, as I'll explain a bit later, in 1857 when they opposed Palmerston, and they were all defeated at the 1857 election. But that was on a particular issue to do with Persia and China, and Layard, on the whole, had very little to do with Cobden and Bright and this whole non-interventionist foreign policy, just as he had very little to do with the main domestic issue of parliamentary reform. So in the Commons, he positioned himself as an outsider. He said, "I had never been a man of speech, more a man of action." And he determined to speak only on subjects that he knew about. And he was very fortunate in his timing, because his arrival in Parliament coincided with the crisis that led to the Crimean War, which, of course, allowed him to speak about his experience in the East. Now, the curious thing is that Layard's speeches were designed to show his expertise, but they also revealed a great prejudice against Lord Aberdeen. Aberdeen was now Prime Minister. Between 1852 and 1855, he led a coalition of Peelites. He had been a Peelite Conservative himself, and Liberals, which was very divided on foreign policy. And Aberdeen had been Foreign Secretary between 1841 and 1846 for the Conservatives. And Aberdeen and Layard did not get on. And Layard, in his maiden speech in 1853, August 1853, criticised Aberdeen already for supporting Russia and supporting peace at the expense of national interests. And in particular, took up the same arguments that he and Stratford Canning, his mentor in Constantinople in the 1840s, had adopted against Aberdeen. Aberdeen was always in favour of peace with Russia then, and in the 1850s, Canning and Layard wanted to stand up to Russia in Constantinople. The whole atmosphere in the embassy in Constantinople was very febrile, very anxious, very neurotic about Russian expansion. And Layard's first job given him by Stratford Canning had been to go to Serbia in 1843 to stop Russian dominance there, which Aberdeen had then frustrated by supporting the Russian initiative in Serbia. So in his maiden speech, Layard turned it into a great rant against Aberdeen's Serbian policy, which, of course, he knew about and indeed was the main architect of. So in 1853, Layard, like Canning, saw, and many others, many other people in Britain saw the big debate as being between Britain and Russia. And this could be developed into an ideological struggle between constitutionalism and humanitarianism in Britain and despotism and autocracy in Russia, which wanted to spread autocracy across the whole world. So Layard developed his views in a series of speeches that he made not only in Parliament but also outside Parliament, some interesting speeches which are preserved in his newspaper cuttings book in the Layard papers, speeches to various popular audiences, which were mainly about Nineveh, in fact, because it was very popular. It was very much an issue of interest to a lot of audiences, what he discovered at Nineveh. And he told them that what he discovered at Nineveh was the importance of class collaboration in Britain and good government. And the point was that these were the sorts of values that we needed in Britain, but also the sorts of values that were needed in the world and that Russia would not supply. So if you look at these speeches, they're all about the need for class collaboration as opposed to government by the few. In Nineveh, there were two classes, the governing, the monopolizing governing classes, and the governed, who had no knowledge, no power. And this is the problem with Eastern nations, including Russia. But our values teach us that all classes should be bound together. Knowledge is the common property of us all. The power of adding to the happiness and contributing to the welfare is what we should be about in politics. And he talks about why Nineveh had fallen. Other nations nearly as powerful as our own had fallen because there was no sympathy between the governors and the governed, no common interest, no common ties. Their religion was a mystery. The high priests and pontiffs, the bishops and clergy made a trade and a mystery of religion, blah, 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 blah. And nations must be communities of progress, and representatives of the people should be the reflex of the people's mind. The rulers of Nineveh lacked true power. They had no rational faith nor true liberty. Their religion was a gross and demoralizing superstition. Their political condition was the arbitrary will of one man, one class. And when he spoke to the Mechanics' Institute, which is a very Benthamite institution for spreading knowledge among working class men, teaching them knowledge. Had there been a Mechanics' Institute in Nineveh to improve the working class, the classes would have developed mutual sympathies and it would not now be a heap of earth. So this is a message about class collaboration, but it's also an anti-Russian message. And Layard went out to Constantinople in 1853 and then again went out to the Crimea in 1854. In order to enhance his authority, he observed all the major battles in the Crimean War. And he wanted to project himself as the expert on the war, much more knowledgeable, of course, than any other MP, really, certainly any MP outside government. But as before, his speeches were also very impassioned against Aberdeen. As soon as the war broke out, he spoke in the Commons to urge the removal of anybody who might be an unsteady hand at the helm, treacherous to the cause, which was a reference to the Prime Minister, Aberdeen. And he attacked his appeasement of Russia really over the last 20 or 30 years. And then here we have also, we have the Punch cartoon of Lord Aberdeen trying to hold back British public opinion, but here's the Lion of Britain running after the Russian bear. And this was very much the view of the public that Aberdeen had been frustrated in his attempt at peace, but now it was time to go to war against Russia. But as soon as the war began, Layard started to criticise the mismanagement of the war, the failure to provide military supplies to the troops, the lack of effective leadership of the army and the navy, and eventually the criticisms of the conduct of the war led to Aberdeen's resignation as Prime Minister in January 1855, and Layard was very much among those who had been calling for that for a long time, and his trip to the Crimea to see the distress and neglect of the soldiers in the Crimea, he communicated what he had found in various speeches when he came back to Britain. So then in February 1855, in the middle of the war, Palmerston became Prime Minister. Gladstone remained, he was Aberdeen's protege, remained Chancellor, so it's still a coalition government. And there now begins to be pressure to give Layard a job in the government. But unfortunately, Layard had offended the Queen because he had made various impassioned speeches naming personalities, naming individuals who had been responsible, in his view, for the failure of the war, particularly Admiral Dundas, who had led the Black Sea Fleet but had failed to take Sebastopol. So when Palmerston tries to give Layard a job, the Queen opposes it and Gladstone opposes it. Both of them say he's unsuitable because he's so vehement and ungentlemanly in his speeches. And then, nonetheless, Palmerston did get him the offer of a job, but only at a department, the Ordnance, which Layard recognised that he was not suitable for because he knew nothing about it. So this theme of expertise meant that he couldn't accept the job that Palmerston had offered him. So he turned it down and he made a great speech saying, what we need in the war is the right men in the right places. And this became his catchphrase, the right men in the right places. I'm not the right man for the Ordnance, so I turn it down. Which was unfortunate because there was really no place that was the right place for him in his own view. So Layard continued to make these very impassioned speeches in 1855, and, for example, these throwaway lines like the public care more for 20,000 gallant lives than even for putting an aristocrat, a Cavendish, in the cabinet. So there were various personal attacks on individuals. This offended all sorts of MPs because they were gentlemen. They often knew the people he was attacking. And things went from bad to worse. In April 1855, 1855, in a speech in a ship at Liverpool, when Layard was almost certainly drunk, at least was reported to be drunk, whether he was drunk or not, but certainly his enemies said he was drunk. He said that the commander-in-chief of the army was, Lord Harding, was too old, utterly unable to discharge his duties. There was a promotion system which put too many aristocrats in high positions in the army, unlike, of course, his own relatives who were losing out. And in terms of politics, Palmerston had betrayed his promise, and the cabinet was full of what he called all the old Whig scum. And not surprisingly, this language was criticised, especially when he repeated quite a lot of it in Parliament a few days later. And so in May 1855, there's a great division between those who think that Layard is an ungentlemanly and angry man, and those who think of him as one of the few who can speak up for the people and the soldiers who are suffering in the Crimea. And so there's quite a lot of support for him. Charles Dickens said he felt he had the spirit of England at his back, and here is in Punch's view of Layard digging out the bull, John Bull, of course, the symbol of England, but here's the bull of Nineveh, and all this jobbery and patronage, incompetency and muddle and routine, which he is, and red tape, which he is trying to clear out, so that the patriotic John Bull can leap forward. In the summer of 1855, there is a risk that this will become seriously radical and subversive, but it all fell away, this mood, after the session of 1855, and Layard showed that he didn't really want to become a subversive revolutionary, and really just wanted to be an expert on diplomatic affairs. So he left the campaign against the war to others, and in any case, once Sebastopol fell to the British in the autumn, it was accepted that things were going a lot better, and the war fizzled out in 1856. Layard then found a new stick with which to beat the government. In 1856, he raised the issue of relations with Persia, and immediately laid into the British minister at Tehran, the incapable Charles Murray, and he warned that Britain was drifting into a war with Persia that would crush the Indian taxpayer, threaten a revolt in India. In early 1857, he tries to get Palmerston to debate the war in Parliament. Palmerston refuses, says the information is too sensitive. And this leads to Layard taking sides with Bright and Cobden, who were opposing both the war in Persia and the bombardment in China at the same time that Palmerston was responsible for. So Layard then goes with Cobden and Bright in attacking Palmerston's aggressive foreign policy in both those areas, and that's what the 1857 election is all about. They defeat Palmerston in Parliament, he calls an election, he wins a great triumph, the people are behind him, Layard and Cobden and Bright all lose their seats. But Layard, you see, had made this great claim that British policy in the East should be bound by the same laws of right and wrong that govern the relations of Christian states, that Britain shouldn't behave badly to Eastern nations just because they're Eastern nations and not Christian nations. So Layard was then out of Parliament for the next 3 years and came back as MP for Southwark in 1860, succeeding another patriotic radical naval hero, Charles Napier. And by now Layard had taken up various issues. He was, of course, very interested in Italian liberty, and as you'll know, was already spending a lot of time in Italy collecting art in the late 50s, and was very connected with a lot of Italian patriots. He'd also opposed the British government of India and had gone out to India after the mutiny in 1857 to see for himself again, to develop the cult of expertise, that he would understand what had gone wrong with British government in India and why it needed to be reformed. And of course he defended the British soldiers in the Crimea. So that was the stance on which he stood to succeed Napier in 1860. And again, Layard was very fortunate in his timing, because coming back to the House of Commons in 1860, Palmerston is Prime Minister, Russell Foreign Secretary, and the government, which has defeated really an attempt to put parliamentary reform on the agenda, was focused mainly on foreign affairs, and particularly had been formed in 1859 on its support for Italian unification. And so it's a very sympathetic environment. It seems to be representing the cause of liberty throughout Europe. And hardly a few months went by after Layard's return to Parliament, but he was brought back into the government in 1861, again as Under Secretary at the Foreign Office, when Russell went to the House of Lords as Foreign Secretary. So this was an ideal job for him. He was able to make lots of speeches in defence of Italy and in defence of the Ottoman Empire. But he did this in his normal, rather vehement and swashbuckling way, because, as you'll know, he's very anti-Catholic, being a Huguenot, makes lots of speeches against the against the Pope, which are designed mainly to annoy the Irish MPs and the Conservatives, both of whom can get tarred with the brush of supporting the Pope and the cause of Catholicism in Italy. So that's really what he's trying to do. And he really winds up the Irish MPs in particular, who of course are quite easy to wind up, by his anti-Catholic rhetoric, the swarm of noxious vermin around the papacy, a horrible priestly tyranny from which it would take Italy some time to recover. So the Irish Catholics like to bait Layard in return. There's this sort of attempt by each side to make them lose their temper and say ungentlemanly things in the House of Commons, and it's a score draw, really. They're both quite good at annoying the other. So Vincent Scully, one Catholic MP, complained Mr. Layard has very unnecessarily and mischievously said everything he could do to incense and annoy the Roman Catholic members of this House. But also Layard started to lay into anybody else who he didn't like, the Taiping rebels in China, a flight of locusts, a band of ruthless marauders intent on murder, rapine and pillage. And again, some people liked this forthright speech. The Daily Telegraph applauded the fact that a minister of the Crown could speak in this way and also represent a popular constituency. But a lot of people thought that it was rather ungentlemanly. And here we have one newspaper saying the Assyrian bull cares little to conciliate but lays about him lustily and gores without mercy all who come in his way. Unfortunately, Mr. Layard's discretion is often in exactly the inverse ratio of his zeal. Now, Layard remained Under Secretary in the Foreign Office until 1866, but the political climate shifted, and having been very favourable to him, it now became very unfavourable because Palmerston died in 1865, and suddenly the issue of parliamentary reform came back on the agenda. And between 1865 and 1867, politics was dominated by the call for a further extension of the franchise. This was then done in the 1867 Reform Act. And in 1868, Gladstone came back to power now as the leader of the Liberal Party. And this state of affairs is very unattractive to Layard. At the same time, being a man of self-confidence and having, of course, now been an MP for quite a long time, in a fairly senior position just outside the cabinet, he expected to be made a cabinet minister by Gladstone in 1868, but Gladstone had no intention whatsoever of making Layard a cabinet minister and made him instead First Commissioner of Works, which is to say in charge of the government estate, the Crown estate, and architecture and so on. And there's an unfortunate row with Junior Treasury Minister, who, as you can see, is a prickly hedgehog, who cares only about saving money. And so, you may know this already, but Layard fell out with Ayrton, and Gladstone, as Prime Minister, supported Ayrton. And so Layard resigned and left for Madrid as ambassador in 1869. So to conclude, then, it's really the Reform Act of 1867, which Layard hadn't wanted, and the revival of party after it, which creates an atmosphere which is very unpleasant for Layard and which he doesn't like. Likes almost everything about post-reform politics. First of all, that he doesn't have a cabinet seat, but secondly, that people like himself who believe in beauty in public offices are being squashed by the Treasury, which just wants to save money because that's what the people want. But also more generally, just because with the revival of party influence after 1867 and a very powerful party system emerging now, with pressure from below, pressure from constituents, and pressure from above, from a strong prime minister like Gladstone, an MP is no longer independent and able to have his own way. And so Layard, exiled to Madrid, complains to his friend William Gregory in 1873 that British politics is going to the dogs, that there's no scope for the independent MP. You need your opinions to run in the accepted groove. You need to be trammelled by constituents and colleagues, and this is not something that he is willing to accept. So he goes off to Madrid, has a diplomatic career, but it is the career, of course, that he had claimed to want as a young man before he had got sidetracked by the fame of Nineveh and its remains into believing he could have a political career. And in a way, the failure of Layard's political career is a failure to recognise that expertise is not always necessary or even desirable if one wants to be a success as a member of Parliament.
So thank you very much, Professor Pellegrini, for this really interesting paper. I have plenty of topic to be discussed, but in particular I would like to emphasize this new insight on Layard personality. I mean a lot of interesting information about his activity that can be extremely useful also to reconsider his activity as an art collector, and I found extremely important is keywords, expertise, in order also to analyze the relationship between diplomatic career and culture, and I think that it will be extremely relevant for our discussion at the end of the morning. Thank you very much. Now, passiamo all'italiano. Presento Maria Stella Florio, che ha un dottorato in filologia Ca' Foscari, si interessa della storia di Venezia, in particolare di Venezia nell'immaginario inglese, e sta lavorando attualmente su Rosalba Carriera, e la sua relazione sarà su Rawdon Brown Anglus 1806-1883. Intanto che sistemiamo il PowerPoint vi dico che dopo questa relazione ci sarà una piccola pausa caffè e poi riprenderemo i lavori con le ultime due relazioni della mattinata e poi la discussione. Grazie.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Can you see me? Almost. Yeah. Now, I'm still listening, actually, but I'm afraid Rawdon Brown was not interested in politics at all. Oh, yes. He's not a household name like Layard, not today. But for several decades during the 19th century, he was the most famous Englishman in Venice. And that was after Byron left, of course, and until Layard himself came to settle here more permanently, that is when he retired, by which time Rawdon Brown was old enough to be worrying about his grave, as we shall see. He arrived in Venice as a young man of 27 and stayed on 50 years. But he was a very private man. This is his only portrait in the Marciana. There is also this photograph, just as elusive. But what we know about him is very little. It comes to us from his many friends and acquaintances. It mostly refers to his life in Venice, and even then, not from the very beginning, because they were not here. We must bear in mind that when he arrived, there was no such thing as an English community in Venice. So, he really was one of the early settlers. This book came out in 2005 and still is the reference book about Rawdon Brown. Some of you are familiar with it, some even contributed to it. It has why he was so famous. Now, First of all, Rawdon Brown was the man who discovered Marin Sanudo's Renaissance diaries, in the sense that he made them known to the world by writing a biography of Sanudo himself, which made him known to the world, eventually led to the publication of all 58 volumes of the diaries. So this is Rawdon Brown's living legacy to Venice scholars all over the world. After that, he conceived a monumental project to account for every single document relating to England that is kept in the Venetian archives. And there are miles to walk there, as we know. He published 6 volumes of them during his lifetime. There are now 38, all produced with material that Rawdon Brown had single-handedly found, transcribed, translated into English, and summarized. They go under the name of a calendar of state Venetian papers. But the book also tells of Rawdon Brown's passion for all things relating to the history of Venice, which often meant also saving them from dispersion or destruction. For instance, he bought the Cadario when it was just a ruin and threatened with demolition, but he restored it and lived there for 4 years. And then the book also tells of his kindness, hospitality, generosity towards all visitors to Venice, even other scholars. And then there was his knowledge of the city that became legendary, so much that when Queen Victoria's youngest son, Prince Leopold, came to visit Venice, they asked Rawdon Brown to show him around. So the book tells all this and much more, but it also asks questions which are still open. Why did he only go back 3 times in 50 years, and then for very short periods? Why did he all but break relations with his family? And first of all, why did he come to Venice in the first place? Now, there is, of course, this story that Rawdon Brown himself liked to tell, that he'd come to Venice on a quest for the Mowbray stone, the tombstone of Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norway. Shakespeare says was banished from England, retired to Venice, and died and was buried here. But scholars in the book feel that this does not ring true. So, for this talk, I thought I'd pick up from there before going on to Rawdon Brown, his background in England, what I found so far about his family and the house where he was born, and then be back again in Venice for his later years and Layard. The Mowbray stone. Shakespeare in Richard II says that Mowbray retired himself to Italy, and there at Venice gave his body to that pleasant country's earth. And Rawdon Brown liked to tell that he'd come to Venice with those verses in his head, inflamed with curiosity, as he put it, to find Mowbray's tombstone. And he did find it, or so he thought. First he found confirmation in Marin Sanudo's diaries that Mowbray had indeed died in Venice and was buried here in 1399. Then years later, thanks to this drawing that he came across in an old book, he was actually able to locate the monument that marked his grave, as it were. It was in the courtyard of the ducal palace. He identified as Mowbray's, wrongly, according to Sarah Quill in the book, had it secretly dislodged, and then eventually smuggled it over to Mowbray's descendants in England. Now, this is a good story, and There are key events, taking place either on Christmas Eve or on a very foggy night in the lagoon. But as I said, scholars have reservations. It may very well be that Rawdon Brown became interested in the mulberry stone after arriving in Venice, as John Pembroke argues in the book, and he's right, of course. We can't rule that out. And yet I tend to believe that he did come to Venice with those verses, Shakespeare verses, in his mind. But the reason is not so much Shakespeare as Byron, because Byron quotes the same lines in a letter that he wrote to a friend of his, John Murray II, the publisher in England from Italy. I have it here. It was published in 1830. That means 3 years before Rawdon Brown left for England. In that letter, Byron says, we know that he left England under a cloud. There was a scandal of his divorce. And he meant never to go back, not even as a dead man. He says in this letter, I wouldn't even feed the worms if I could help it. And goes on to quote Shakespeare's lines, and then expresses the wish to be buried at the Lido, the foreigners' burial ground at the Lido. Now, as I said, it came out in 1830. Anyway, a copy of this edition, Byron's first biography, is among the books that he left to the Marciana. About 400 of them he bequeathed. There is this edition. There are subsequent editions of this biography. There are 2 sets of Byron's complete works, plus spare copies of Don Juan and Manfred, all carefully annotated and underlined. Now, I don't mean to say that he was obsessed with Byron, but Byron's influence on his generation and the next, especially with regard to Venice, cannot be underestimated. It was enormous, and Ruskin says it openly. My Venice, like Turner's, had been chiefly created by Byron. And so this takes me to England and the second part of my talk. This England, the England that he left was Regency England, as we can see from the lady's fashion. Is a portrait of Victoria, Princess of Kent, as she then was. She acceded 4 years later. And this portrait is 1833, the same year that Rawdon Brown left. So this was the England of Jane Austen and of Samuel Rogers. They celebrated the Regency wit. We'll meet him again later, but he was, he celebrated breakfast. Their entry meant entry in the best society and success. As we can see, there is Rogers in the middle, of course, with Byron on his right, in a very Byronic attitude, which was already part of his legend at the time of this composition. That was 1815. He died 9 years later, when Rawdon Brown was 18. He was born in London, was the second child of Hugh William Brown and Anna Eliza Lubbock. He was christened Rawdon Lubbock Brown. That is, he was also given his mother's family name, which I understand was a common practice at the time. Layard too was christened Austin Henry Layard, where Austin was his mother's maiden name. So it was a way to honor the mother's side, I believe. And in fact, from the very start, Rawdon Brown's family seems to have consisted mostly of his Lubbock relations. John Lubbock, here portrayed at 18, was his mother's uncle, at whose house actually Rawdon Brown was born, and that was in London. But the family itself originated in Norfolk, the village of Lambs, from where John had been sent to London to learn business in a banking house, and there he became a partner, married his partner's daughter, was made a baronet. Since he had no issue, the title went passed on by special remainder to his brother's son, John William, who joined him in the London house, while Anna Eliza, his sister, married Hugh William Brown. Now, we know nothing about William Brown, not even the date of his death. So it was very interesting to come across the memoirs of a contemporary who recalls them a bit cattily, perhaps, because apparently one of her brothers had courted Eliza, and I quote, who seemed to have encouraged and accepted his addresses, and then had thrown him over for a man with the plebeian name of Brown. And he's, in these memoirs, it is described, I pick here and there, as an individual with a fair exterior and an empty head, who failed in his original business and disappeared from the scene, leaving a widow and family. About this family, they never forgot that they had a baronetcy in the family. And in short, according to these memoirs, they were snobs. And in fact, the Labbos were becoming increasingly distinguished. Now, Rawdon Brown's cousin, for instance, was a banker, but he was also a mathematician, an astronomer, and a close friend of Darwin's. Whereas his son, John, may be familiar to some of you because he was always a banker, of course, but he was involved in archaeology. He coined the terms Paleolithic and Neolithic. Actually, he was made Baron Avery on account of his involvement with archaeology. As an MP, he enacted, among others, the Ancient Monuments Act, as well as before that the Bank Holidays Act. He was also an amateur biologist, complete full Victorian now. He wrote on ants, bees, and wasps. So eventually he deserved, of course, a cartoon in Punch, like Layard before him. They were, of course, in touch. All this apparently did not help Eliza's economic situation. And long after Rawdon left, was in Venice, she was still embarrassed by her late husband's debts, and there is the mention of a bail bond in one of her letters. But she does not seem to have found in the younger Lubbock, Rawdon's cousin, the third baronet, the same understanding that she'd met with from her brother and her uncle before him, Sir John, the first baronet, who in fact seems to have taken them in at a very early date, since that's where Rawdon Brown was born, in his house. Now, this house is also interesting for our story of this. Sir John himself had built it, in the sense that originally he, together with a friend, had bought a large house in St. James's Place with the idea of pulling it down and turning it into residences. That was not feasible. They had to pull it down. They built two separate houses on the site, one each. Now, the one in the middle is Sir John's house, number 23, St. James's Place. The one on the right is that of his friend, who was Rogers, Summer Rogers. There on the ground floor there is the celebrated breakfast room with a bow window overlooking the park and Buckingham Palace across from it. A typical Regency townhouse. Byron, incidentally, lived around the corner from St. James's Street, number 8. Now, these houses are not there anymore. They were damaged in the Blitz and were demolished. But Rogers lived there 50 years. He died in 93. So he received 3 generations of personalities there from the continent as well as from the States, had a very good relationship with Americans. This portrait is at Harvard University. So we have many descriptions of the house itself, which was considered a little jewel, and the art collections. There are 3 paintings of the best he bequeathed to the National Gallery. In the breakfast room, there hung this fragment of a Florentine fresco, end of 14th century, also now at the National Gallery. Now, John Law, in the book, already envisaged Samuel Rogers as a possible literary influence on Rawdon Brown. All the more his influence, I believe, can be assumed now that we know that he grew up with Samuel Rogers as a long-standing family friend and next-door neighbors. But it was not so much, in my opinion, a literary influence as that of a man of taste, an influence that Rogers exercised all over England. Nowadays, I find that he's been credited with having switched the English taste from classical Italian art and architecture, that's the one of the Grand Tour, to medieval and Renaissance art that are post-Waterloo travelers to Italy. And this he did with his last and most successful book of poetry that was called Italy, in fact, which was also a travelogue and a historical guide to Italy, and was lavishly illustrated by the best artists of the time, Prout, Stothard, and of course Turner. And apropos of influence, this was the book that Ruskin was given on his 13th birthday, and we know what it did to him. He later ascribed to it the entire direction of his life's energies. But Rogers was also a famous Regency wit, which meant also malicious wit at times. So he was a subject for parody. It seems that guests had to come prepared because Rogers, someone put it, served up his friends as he served up his fish with a squeeze of lemon on each. For his part, he would argue, I have a very weak voice. If I didn't say ill-natured things, no one would hear what I said. Now, all this seems to me very much in the spirit of in which Rawdon Brown grew up, and he shared this sort of attitude for clever satire with his great friend and contemporary Edward Cheney. When they were together in Venice, they actually bounced off each other, and this apparently irritated young Ruskin because he considered them men of the word, meaning not serious enough. Though, of course, he acknowledged that they were as good-natured as they could be. And Samuel Rogers also was very kind, despite the sharp tongue. And a friend once defended him by saying, borrow £400 from him, and he will never say a word against you till you want to repay him. But it was not only financial assistance that Rogers gave, it was also advice, encouragement, and he would use his powerful influence to help. So, about the young boy that grew up next door, virtually fatherless, virtually with no income. At the very least, Rogers may have provided him with the letters of introduction that he had to Venice with. And anyway, it seems there was not much for Rawdon Brown to be doing in England. He later said he'd been debarred from public life because of his lisp, someone assumed at the time, but I now think it was also because of his father's embroilments. So it seems really Venice was the making of him. And for one thing, he never used the name Lubbock in any of his work, and not even on his tombstone. though the lisp was there to stay, and Lady Eastlake sometimes imitated it in her letters to intimate friends like Layard, for instance, and especially when she got bored with his musty archives. So we are back in Venice now for the last part of my talk, and of the Venice where he arrived, we all retained such gloomy impressions of Venice, but not from Layard's autobiography. When he passed through here briefly in 1839, on his way east, he was happily visiting the art galleries. So they did not meet then. And yet it is through Layard that we get some very early glimpses of Rawdon Brown's life in Venice, soon after his arrival. We already knew that for the first years he'd stayed in a certain Casa Paulinelli at Samoise, which so far has been difficult to locate. But now, thanks to Layard, I believe it can be identified with the Palazzo Contarini Fasan. And you must tell me what you think. There is a long description that Layard sent to a friend of his in India, who had inquired specifically about the exact position of this Casa Paulinelli in Venice. And this is part of a larger story, but I'm not going to go into that now. Layard sent back a lengthy note, and in short, he described a small house of the 15th or end of 14th century, charmingly situated on the Grand Canal, nearly opposite the Church of the Salute, with the facade occupied by one Gothic, Venetian Gothic window. He also says that it was owned by a Paduan named Camerini, and this was at the time of his writing, that was a few months actually after Rawdon Brown's death in 1883. And finally he says, Rawdon Brown used to point it out to him, I quote, as the pleasantest house he had occupied in Venice. 40 years on, when these conversations were taking place, Rawdon Brown was already staying in at the Palazzo Grimani Gussone dalla Vida. That's where he stayed for the last 30 and so years of his life, with his beautiful collection of longhi and a couple of guardie, among other things, yes. And that's where Layard would visit him. I'm not sure when they first met exactly. Lady Eastlake first mentioned Layard in a letter to Rawdon Brown as early as 1856, but it's a rather cryptic remark. It says, Layard, who is a favorite of mine, I must not talk to you about. Whatever she said, she meant this correspondence between them begins 5 years later, in 1861. And during this time, these 5 years, Rawdon Brown had been trying to convince the British government of the importance of what he was doing in Venice for his project for the calendar of state Venetian papers. He brought attention to it by publishing a book based on the dispatches of the Venetian ambassador at the court of Henry VIII. And this interested Palmerston and Layard as well. And it was in fact Layard who, in 61, when he was Under Secretary for Foreign Affairs, who finally brought the thing about. He worked behind the scenes, of course, but he also was among the signatories of a memorial to the government urging that he sponsor the publication of the calendars and appoint Rawdon Brown to the job. Equally important, later on, it was again Layard who ensured that Rawdon Brown's work was continued after his death. And he used his influence to have Horatio Brown appointed to the task. There's no relation, but they're often mixed up. So they had this interest for the past in common, and after all, the terms archive and archaeology have the same root, that's the past. And Layard himself, much later on, would publish dispatches of two 16th century Venetian ambassadors in France, and that was for the Huguenot Society. But Rawdon Brown loved only the past. And so he was pro-Austrian, for instance. He was against the unification of Venice to Italy. He worried about the state of the archives and the new management, obviously. Layard was all for it, was in favor for it, worked actively, as we heard, towards it. So in November 1866, he was here to see the actual handover of Venice. And as soon as the treaty was signed, he entered into the famous partnership with Salviati. There is a little mystery here, the reason why they split up, but I leave that for a question if anyone's interested. But there is also another little mystery in Layard's Venetian life. Just 2 years before this, I mention it because this is everything, you know, Layard. In 1864, Lady Eastlake had written to Rawdon Brown, talking of liaison, there has been an immense scandal about how friend Layard and the lady he escorts in Italy, and I believe has also fascinated somewhat a friend of mine in Venice, meaning obviously Rawdon Brown haven't attempted to find out who that was. In 1866, all he seems to be interested in is the Salviati enterprise. And in fact, that may be seen as the harbinger of the new generation of resident strangers, as John Pembroke in the book calls them. They settled here much later in the 1880s, and he describes them as more commercial, financial, and conventionally philanthropic. And this was quite in the spirit of the time, now fully Victorian. And in fact, Rawdon Brown didn't hold with, for instance, philanthropy. He would say benevolence, as Lady Eastlake would spell it for him. And of course, Rawdon Brown didn't take any part in the Salviati enterprise. He would gladly help another shareholder, Sir William Drake, in making research for his book on Venetian ceramics. But Rawdon Brown didn't have the head for business, nor the means, whereas Layard was an expert at international high finance. He was one of the founders of the Ottoman Bank, and its first chairman, and that's where his wealth came from, not from an ambassador's pension. More to the point, Rawdon Brown didn't have the mentality. Just an example to conclude, a bit ghoulish perhaps. In later life, Layard became a supporter of cremation and wrote to congratulate the secretary of the Cremation Society of Britain for the progress they were making in that direction. Then he adds, when devising an urn or sarcophagus for the ashes, why not think of glass? My Venezia and Murano company made a beautiful glass of onyx color to take the ashes of Castellani, the celebrated jeweler and antiquary. Should you be looking into the shop in St. James's Street, Mr. Smith, our manager, could show you some specimens of funeral glass urns upon Roman models. Rawdon Brown, by contrast, as soon as he turned 60, had made arrangements to be buried at the Lido, like we know who. But then burials were not allowed there anymore, so he worried. Then in Lady Layard's journal, we find this entry dated 2 years before his death. Mr. Brown came to see us. He seemed in good health and temper. Said Mr. Malcolm has eased his mind by finding him a nice grave next his own in the new cemetery. And that's, of course, San Michele now, the Reparto Evangelico, and there are his. On his tombstone, still simply Rawdon Brown, Anglus. Thank you.
Grazie molte per questa comunicazione. Trovo assolutamente interessante soprattutto il fatto, questa intersecazione tra i residenti stranieri e la cultura italiana, soprattutto anche la produzione artistica italiana. Io pensavo anche a Stibert con Cantagalli nei soliti anni. Dunque anche per questo ci sarà spazio nella discussione finale. Ora c'è la pausa caffè, io credo circa un quarto d'ora, e poi ricominciamo alle 11:10. Grazie.